November 28, 1941. Far East Combined Bureau, Singapore. The ceiling fans rotate slowly above Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Wilkinson's desk, barely moving the thick tropical air that hangs in the signal's intelligence room. He leans closer to the decrypt, his finger tracing each line of text that has just come through from Station X Bletchley Park 7,000 miles away in England. The paper trembles slightly in his hand, not from the breeze but from what he's reading. The words are clinical, translated from Japanese military code, but their meaning is catastrophic. Army strength, 25,000 men, 211 tanks, 560 aircraft. Invasion route, Thailand and northern Malaya. Timeline, mid-December, possibly as early as the 8th. Objective, Singapore. Wilkinson sets down the decrypt and reaches for another. Then another. Over the past 72 hours, ultra-intercepts have been arriving with increasing frequency, each one adding another piece to a picture that is now horrifyingly complete. The Japanese aren't just planning to test British defenses in Southeast Asia. They're preparing to destroy them. He stands abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Around him, other intelligence officers hunch over their own desks, earphones clamped to their heads, fingers flying across typewriters as they process the steady stream of enemy communications that Britain's codebreakers have cracked. The Far East Combined Bureau has been tracking Japanese naval movements for months, but this is different. These aren't ship positions or diplomatic cables. These are operational orders, complete with unit designations, landing zones, and timetables. Wilkinson walks to the large map mounted on the wall. His eyes trace the thin line of the Malay Peninsula, that finger of land stretching from Thailand down to the island fortress of Singapore at its tip. Red pins mark the estimated positions of Japanese forces gathering in Indochina. Blue pins show British positions pitifully few in comparison. He does the calculation in his head. If the Japanese land here, at Kota Bharu and Singora, with the force strength the intercepts indicate, and if they advance at the rate their timetable suggests, 2 weeks, he says aloud. Maybe 3. Captain James Morrison looks up from his desk. Sir. From first landing to Singapore. Wilkinson taps the map. If they come through the jungle, if they coordinate air and ground forces the way these intercepts suggest, they'll be at our doorstep in a fortnight. Morrison walks over, scanning the map. He's younger than Wilkinson, keener to believe in the fortress Singapore represents the naval base, the coastal guns, the carefully cultivated image of British invincibility in the east. The jungle's impassable to armor, sir. Everyone says so. They'd have to stick to the roads, and we can defend those. Everyone says so, Wilkinson repeats quietly. He returns to his desk and picks up another decrypt, this one from 3 days ago. The Japanese 5th Division. Do you know where they've been for the past 4 years? China, sir. Fighting through terrain that makes Malaya look like Hyde Park. Rice paddies, mountains, rivers, jungle. And they've been winning. Wilkinson drops the paper on his desk. We're basing our entire defensive strategy on the assumption that the Japanese can't do something they've already been doing for years. He gathers the decrypts into a folder, securing them with string. The material is marked ultra, the highest classification in the British intelligence apparatus, restricted to a handful of officers who know that Britain has broken the Japanese military codes. This knowledge is so sensitive that Churchill himself has decreed it must be protected at all costs. Men must die, Churchill said, before ultra is compromised. But what good is the intelligence if no one acts on it? Wilkinson carries the folder through the building's corridors, past clerks and junior officers who don't have the clearance to know what he knows. He climbs the stairs to the upper floor where Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke-Popham maintains his headquarters. The Commander-in-Chief Far East is responsible for all British forces from Burma to Hong Kong, a vast territory that exists, in Brooke-Popham's mind and in London's, as a series of strong points and naval bases that the Japanese would never dare attack. The secretary makes him wait. Wilkinson stands in the outer office, watching the clock on the wall tick away minutes. Through the window, he can see Singapore Harbour, crowded with merchant vessels and naval craft. The Prince of Wales and Repulse, Britain's most modern capital ships, arrived just 3 days ago, a show of force meant to deter Japanese aggression. Wilkinson thinks of the intercepts describing Japanese aerial torpedo tactics, practiced relentlessly in preparation for exactly this kind of target. Finally, he's admitted. Brooke-Popham sits behind his desk, looking every bit his 63 years, his face worn by decades of colonial administration and his mind, Wilkinson suspects, trapped in memories of the last war. The Air Chief Marshal barely glances up as Wilkinson enters. "Lieutenant Colonel. I assume this is important." "It is, sir." Wilkinson places the folder on the desk. Ultra intercepts from the past week. They indicate a major Japanese offensive being prepared against Malaya and Singapore. The intelligence is detailed unit strengths, landing sites, timing. "Sir, they're coming, and they're coming soon. Possibly within 2 weeks." Brooke-Popham opens the folder, leafs through the first few pages, then closes it. "We've had intelligence reports before, Wilkinson. The Japanese have been making threatening noises for months. This is different, sir. These are operational orders, not threats. They've assembled 25,000 men, armor, and significant air assets. The intercepts show coordination between their navy and army that suggests dash. The Japanese," Brooke-Popham interrupts, leaning back in his chair, "are not going to attack Singapore. Oh, they might probe our defenses in the north, test our resolve. But a full-scale invasion? Through jungle? Impossible." He taps the folder. "I don't question the accuracy of your intercepts, Colonel. But I do question the interpretation. The Japanese are not capable of the kind of operation you're describing." Wilkinson feels something cold settle in his stomach. "Sir, with respect, their recent operations in China suggest otherwise. And these intercepts are quite explicit about their intentions. Their intentions and their capabilities are two different things." Brooke-Popham stands, walking to his own map of the region. "Singapore is a fortress. The Japanese know this. Any attack would require control of the air, which they cannot achieve, and an advance through terrain that no army can navigate with the speed you're suggesting. Our intelligence has consistently shown that Japanese equipment is inferior, their pilots poorly trained, their forces overstretched." He turns back to Wilkinson. "I appreciate your diligence, but I will not panic this command based on what may well be Japanese disinformation." "Sir, these are not dash. That will be all, Colonel." Wilkinson salutes, retrieving the folder. As he reaches the door, Brooke-Popham calls after him, "Do keep monitoring their communications, though. Always useful to know what the enemy is thinking." Back in the signals intelligence room, Wilkinson sits at his desk and opens his diary. He records the date, the time, the substance of his warning, and Brooke-Popham's dismissal. Morrison approaches, reading his expression. "No luck, sir." He thinks it's disinformation. Or overconfidence. Or both. Wilkinson looks at the calendar on his wall. November 28th. If the intercepts are accurate, and they've been accurate before, the invasion will begin in 10 days, maybe less. Get me everything we have on Japanese jungle warfare doctrine, equipment, training, tactics, and pull the files on the 5th and 18th Divisions. If command won't listen to signals intelligence, maybe they'll listen to order of battle analysis. Over the next week, more intercepts arrive. Each one confirms the previous. Japanese forces are moving into position in southern Thailand and Indokod. Aircraft are being staged at bases in Saigon. Naval units are assembling for convoy escort duties. The timetable holds firm, early December, a coordinated strike against multiple targets across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Wilkinson sends reports. He requests meetings. He presents his analysis to any officer with sufficient clearance to read ultra material. Some listen with concern. Others dismiss him as an alarmist. None have the authority to change the fundamental assumptions on which British strategy in Malaya rests: that the jungle is impassable, that Japanese forces are inferior, that Singapore is invulnerable. On December 6th, Wilkinson receives a decrypt that makes his blood run cold. Japanese submarines have been detected moving into position around Singapore and along the Malayan coast. Transport ships are departing Saigon and Hainan. Air reconnaissance reports large formations of aircraft moving south. He writes one final report, stamping it urgent across the top. In it, he estimates that war will begin within 48 hours. He predicts landings at Kota Bharu and possibly Singora in Thailand. He forecasts that Japanese forces will advance rapidly down the peninsula, using their air superiority to devastate British defensive positions. And he concludes with a sentence that he knows will haunt him: if current intelligence proves accurate, Singapore can expect to be under siege within 2 weeks of the initial landing, and may fall within 4 weeks. The report goes up the chain of command. Some file it away. Others mark it noted. Brooke-Popham never responds. On December 7, 1941, December 8, on the other side of the international date line, Wilkinson sits in his office as the sun rises over Singapore. The city below is waking to another day of colonial routine, its streets filling with workers, its harbour crowded with ships, its population of 1 million utterly unaware that their world is about to end. At 4 a.m. local time, the phone rings. Wilkinson grabs the receiver. The voice on the other end belongs to Squadron Leader Atkins from the Royal Air Force Operations Room, and it's tight with tension. Japanese bombers over Kota Bharu. At least 50 aircraft. They're hitting the airfield now. Wilkinson checks his watch. 4:15 a.m. He pulls out his file of intercepts, fingers finding the decrypt dated December 3rd. Estimated time of first attack, 4 to 4:30 hours. Target: Kota Bharu Airfield and Beachhead. He closes his eyes briefly, feeling no satisfaction at being right. "Get me a line to headquarters," he tells Morrison, who's just rushed in, "and start pulling all intercepts related to Phase 2 operations. They'll want to know what comes next." But even as he says it, Wilkinson knows the truth. They won't want to know. They'll keep believing, right until Singapore harbour fills with Japanese ships, that this is a limited incursion, a probing attack, something that can be contained and pushed back. By 5 a.m., the reports are flooding in. Japanese forces have landed at Kota Bharu under cover of Darkness 3 transport ships, disgorging troops onto the beaches while their bombers suppress the RAF airfield. Indian Army units are engaging the invaders, but the initial resistance is fierce and confused. Then comes the second wave of news. Japanese troops have also crossed the Thai border at multiple points, moving south with disturbing speed. Wilkinson spreads the reports across his desk, comparing them to his intercepts. Landing sites: confirmed. Troop strength: confirmed. Axis of advance: confirmed. The Japanese are executing their plan with precision, exactly as their communications indicated they would. At dawn, he's summoned to an emergency briefing. The room is crowded with officers, their faces showing various stages of shock and denial. Maps are being updated with red arrows showing Japanese advances, arrows that are already pushing deeper into Malaya than anyone thought possible on the first day. General Arthur Percival, the general officer commanding Malaya, stands at the front of the room. He's a tall, thin man with a mustache and an expression of perpetual worry that has now intensified into something approaching panic. "Gentlemen," he begins, his voice carrying across the silent room, "we are at war with Japan. As you know, they have landed forces at Kota Bharu and violated Thai neutrality with incursions across the northern border. We have also received reports unconfirmed that the Americans have been attacked at Pearl Harbor." A murmur runs through the room. Percival holds up his hand for silence. "Our immediate concern is containing the northern landing. The 8th Indian Infantry Brigade is engaging Japanese forces at Kota Bharu, and we expect them to hold. The Japanese appear to have committed significant forces, but they lack supplies and will be operating far from their bases. We anticipate their offensive will culminate within several days, at which point we can counterattack." Wilkinson stands. "Sir, if I may, intelligence intercepts suggest this is not a limited operation. The Japanese have prepared for an extended campaign with supply lines through Thailand. Their advance will not culminate, it will accelerate." Percival's expression hardens. "Colonel Wilkinson, I am aware of your concerns. But we must deal with the situation as it is, not as intelligence analysts fear it might become. The 8th Brigade will hold at Kota Bharu. The 11th Division will defend the northern approaches. We have prepared positions, minefields, defensive lines. The Japanese will break themselves against our defenses. But by noon, the 8th Brigade is retreating from Kotabaru. Japanese air superiority is total. RAF Brewster Buffalo fighters are being shot from the sky by the faster, more maneuverable Japanese fighters that intelligence reports had assured command were inferior. The Japanese Zero, it turns out, can outfly, outclimb, and outfight anything the British have in theatre. Wilkinson receives a decrypt late in the afternoon that makes his jaw clench. It's a Japanese naval communication reporting a successful airstrike against major British capital ships off the coast of Kuantan. Prince of Wales and repulse the ships that arrived just days ago to deter Japanese aggression have been attacked by torpedo bombers. He runs the message to naval headquarters himself, arriving breathless at the operations room. An officer takes the decrypt, scans it, then looks up with hollow eyes. We've just received confirmation. Both ships sunk. Prince of Wales went down at 13:20 hours. Repulse at 13:23. Admiral Phillips is dead. Over 800 men lost. The room goes silent. The Prince of Wales was one of Britain's newest battleships, barely a year old. Repulse was a battle cruiser with a legendary reputation. Both sunk in a single afternoon by aircraft, the same aircraft that intelligence had said were outdated and poorly flown. Wilkinson walks back to his office in a daze. The Japanese have been in Malaya for less than 24 hours, and they've already destroyed Britain's naval deterrent, secured air superiority, and established multiple beachheads. Everything is happening exactly as the intercepts predicted. No, it's happening faster. That evening, he plots Japanese advances on his personal map. The enemy is pushing down from Thailand along multiple routes, their forces moving through terrain that British commanders had declared impassable. Infantry divisions are advancing 15 miles per day through jungle, supported by tanks that supposedly couldn't navigate the narrow roads. Japanese engineers are bridging rivers, repairing bombed roadways, and maintaining supply lines with an efficiency that makes a mockery of every assumption British planners had made. Morrison brings him dinner rice and tinned meat from the commissary. Wilkinson eats mechanically, his eyes never leaving the map. They're using bicycles, Morrison says quietly. The intelligence summaries report Japanese infantry on thousands of bicycles, moving down jungle tracks faster than our troops can retreat along the roads. Wilkinson nods. Another detail from the intercepts, dismissed as irrelevant. The Japanese had trained for this light infantry, minimal supply requirements, maximum mobility. While British units needed trucks, supply trains, and prepared positions, Japanese soldiers could live off the land, carry their own equipment, and attack from directions defenders thought impossible. Over the next week, the pattern repeats with numbing regularity. British units establish defensive positions. Japanese forces probe, find flanks in the jungle, and attack from unexpected directions. British commanders order withdrawals to new defensive lines. The retreats become routes as Japanese aircraft strafe the roads and Japanese tanks appear where no tanks should be able to go. December 15th, Penang evacuated, abandoned to the Japanese without a fight, its European population fleeing while Asian civilians are left behind. December 18th, Japanese cross the Perak River, forcing the 11th Indian Division into full retreat. December 22nd, British abandon the northern half of Malaya, withdrawing to new positions at Kampar. Wilkinson tracks it all, comparing the reality to his intercepts. The Japanese are actually moving faster than their own timetable predicted. They're supposed to take 3 weeks to reach Kuala Lumpur. They'll make it in 2. On December 23rd, he's called to another briefing. Percival looks like he's aged a decade in 2 weeks. The general's hands shake slightly as he points to the map, showing the contracted British positions. We are establishing a strong defensive line here, at Kampar. The terrain favors Defence A narrow front between jungle and coast. We will hold them here while reinforcements arrive from India and Australia. How long can we hold? Someone asks. As long as necessary. We still outnumber them. We still have the better positions. The Japanese supply lines are stretched thin. They must dash. An aide enters with a message slip. Percival reads it, and something in his face crumbles. Japanese forces have landed on the west coast at Telokansan, behind our lines at Kampar. He sets down the paper carefully, as if it might break. We will have to withdraw again. The Kampar line, prepared over weeks, is held for 3 days before being abandoned. The British retreat south, always south, through Kuala Lumpur, through Seremban, toward the southern tip of the peninsula and the causeway that connects Malaya to Singapore Island. Wilkinson works 18-hour days, processing intercepts that now read like victory dispatches from the Japanese High Command. Their units are reporting light casualties, ample supplies, and collapsing British resistance. One decrypt, dated December 28, includes an assessment from a Japanese division commander: enemy resistance weaker than anticipated. Advance ahead of schedule. Singapore within reach by mid-January. On December 31, 1941, Wilkinson stands on the roof of his building at midnight, watching fireworks over Singapore Harbour. The city is celebrating New Year's Eve as if nothing is wrong, as if the remnants of British forces aren't streaming down the peninsula just 100 miles away, as if Japanese aircraft aren't flying reconnaissance missions over the city every day. He thinks of his report from December 6, the one where he predicted Singapore would be under siege within 2 weeks. He was wrong. It's going to be faster than that. January begins with disaster piled upon disaster. The 11th Indian Division, which began the campaign with 15,000 men, is down to less than 3,000 effectives. Australian reinforcements arrive at Singapore only to be immediately rushed north to plug gaps in crumbling defensive lines. Japanese forces capture one airfield after another, moving their fighters south, extending their air superiority umbrella. On January 9, Wilkinson receives an intercept from the Japanese 5th Division, Johor Bahru in sight. Final approach to Singapore commencing. He looks at his calendar. December 8 to January 9. 32 days from first landing to the gates of Singapore. He'd predicted 2 weeks to siege. The Japanese have done it in 4.5. That afternoon, he watches from his window as the last British forces cross the causeway from Malaya onto Singapore Island. Engineers are preparing to blow the causeway, to turn Singapore back into the island fortress it was always supposed to be. Except it was never supposed to be defended from the north. The massive coastal guns point out to sea, toward an enemy that has come instead through the jungle. Wilkinson pulls out his file of intercepts one more time. There's a decrypt from January 7th that he's been avoiding, one that outlines Japanese plans for the assault on Singapore itself. He reads it now, slowly, feeling each word like a weight. Attack date, January 8 to 10th, landing sites, northwest coast of island. Estimated time to British surrender, 7 to 10 days. He does the math. If they attack on the 10th, and if they're right about the timeline, Singapore will fall by January 20th. He writes it in his diary, underlines it twice, then closes the book and locks it in his desk drawer. There's nothing more he can do. He's warned everyone who would listen, and none of them listened enough. The intelligence was perfect. The predictions were accurate. And none of it mattered. January 10, 1942. The explosions begin at 10:30 p.m. Wilkinson is in the signals room when the first shells hit the northern shore of Singapore Island. The building shakes, dust falling from the ceiling, and he knows without checking his intercepts that the Japanese assault has begun exactly on schedule. He can hear the artillery, not British guns firing out, but Japanese guns firing in, their batteries positioned on the Johor shore, methodically pounding the positions where British and Australian troops crouch in hastily prepared defences. The intercept on his desk, decoded just 3 hours ago, specified the landing zones, the northwest coast between the Kranji and Jurong rivers. The Japanese 5th and 18th Divisions, reinforced with Imperial Guards. 23,000 men in the first wave. H-hour, 10 p.m. hours. Morrison bursts into the room. They're shelling the causeway area and the western beaches. Our observers report landing craft assembling on the Johor side. It's not the causeway, Wilkinson says quietly. That's a feint. The main assault will hit the northwest shore Australian positions. He taps the intercept. The Guards Division will cross at the causeway as a secondary attack, but the breakthrough will come at Sarimban Beach and Kranji. The Australians are spread too thin there. The Japanese know it. How do they know it? Because they've been reading British communications just as effectively as Bletchley has been reading theirs. Because Japanese reconnaissance flights have photographed every defensive position. because captured documents from retreating units in Malaya have given them complete order of battle information. The shelling intensifies. Wilkinson can track the Japanese artillery pattern just from the sound systematic, walking their fire from east to west along the northern shore, suppressing defensive positions before the landing craft hit the beaches. He's read the Japanese training manuals, studied their tactics from China. They're executing a textbook assault, and the British are defending with a fraction of the forces needed to hold a coastline this long. At midnight, the phone rings. It's an Australian liaison officer, his voice nearly drowned out by explosions in the background. Japanese are landing in force at Sarimban. We're engaging, but there's too many of them. They're coming ashore in hundreds of boats, landing craft, fishing vessels, anything that floats. We need reinforcements. Where are the reserves? Wilkinson asks Morrison after hanging up. Being held in the southeast. Percival still thinks the main attack might come from the south or east. Wilkinson closes his eyes. Even now, after everything, command is preparing for the attack they expected rather than the attack that's actually happening. The Japanese intercepts have been explicit: northwest assault, Kranjijurong line, breakthrough to the city reservoirs, cut off the water supply, and Singapore surrenders. It's all there in black and white, decoded and distributed, and still being ignored. By dawn on January 11th, Japanese forces have secured multiple beachheads. The Australian 22nd Brigade is fighting desperately, but they're outnumbered 3-1 and taking fire from Japanese artillery that the British counter-battery fire can't suppress. Wilkinson receives reports throughout the morning: Japanese troops pushing inland, Australian units falling back, defensive lines collapsing. He plots the advances on his map with red ink. The Japanese are moving faster than even their own optimistic timetables projected. They've captured Tenga airfield by noon. By evening, they're threatening the Bukit-Timah Road, the main artery connecting the northern and southern halves of the island. January 12th brings worse news. British and Australian counterattacks fail to dislodge Japanese positions. The enemy has brought tanks across the causeway, the repaired causeway, because British engineers failed to destroy it thoroughly, and Japanese engineers rebuilt it in just 2 days. Wilkinson reads an intercept reporting the tank crossing and feels something inside him break. Every single failure was predicted. Every single mistake was foreseeable. And every single warning was dismissed. The city is starting to panic. Civilians crowd the docks, desperate for ships that aren't coming. The European population receives priority for evacuation, while Asian residents, Chinese, Malay, Indian, are left to face Japanese occupation. Wilkinson watches from his window as smoke rises from the harbor, from burning oil tanks, from bombed buildings. Japanese aircraft rule the sky now, their fighters and bombers attacking at will because the RAF has no more aircraft left to oppose them. On January 13th, the Japanese capture Bukit-Timah village and the food depots nearby. 1 million rations, enough to feed the entire Japanese invasion force for weeks. Percival's headquarters issues optimistic communiques about fluid situations and temporary withdrawals, but Wilkinson reads the intercepts celebrating Japanese victories and knows the truth. The British are beaten. They just haven't admitted it yet. That evening, he's summoned to a meeting at Fort Canning, Percival's headquarters in the center of the city. The underground command bunker is hot, crowded, and stinks of sweat and fear. Officers huddle around maps, arguing about defensive lines that no longer exist and reinforcements that will never arrive. Percival looks like a ghost. His uniform hangs loose on his frame, his face is grey with exhaustion, and his eyes have the hollow look of a man watching everything he believed in crumble to dust. "Colonel Wilkinson," he says when he notices him. "Your intelligence section. Do you have any information on Japanese intentions for the next phase?" Wilkinson wants to scream. He wants to throw his files of ignored intercepts on the table, wants to ask why anyone cares about his intelligence now when they ignored it for 2 months. Instead, he says, "Sir, the intercepts indicate the Japanese plan to push south to Alexandra and west to Pasir Panjang, cutting the city off from the remaining water reservoirs. Once they control the reservoirs, they expect us to surrender within days." Expected timeline. They're ahead of schedule, sir. I would estimate they'll reach the reservoirs by January 15th. After that. He doesn't finish. He doesn't have to. A British colonel objects. We still have 60,000 troops on this island. The Japanese can't have more than 30,000. We outnumber them 2-1. We should counterattack, push them back into the sea. Wilkinson sees Morrison in the corner, sees his young colleague's face twist with frustration. They've been through this so many times. Numbers don't matter when one side has their superiority, armor, momentum, and confidence, while the other is exhausted, demoralized, and commanded by officers still fighting the last war. The Japanese, Wilkinson says carefully, have demonstrated throughout this campaign that they can achieve disproportionate results with smaller forces. Their tactics, training, and morale give them effective superiority despite our numerical advantage. A counterattack would dash. Thank you, Colonel, Percival interrupts. We'll take your assessment under advisement. Wilkinson leaves the bunker and emerges into chaos. The city is burning in a dozen places. Artillery shells are falling on the harbor. Wounded soldiers lie on the streets, waiting for ambulances that never come. He walks back to his office through crowds of terrified civilians, past looters breaking into abandoned shops, past Indian Army soldiers who've thrown away their weapons and are trying to blend in with the civilian population. January 14th. Japanese forces capture the Alexandra area, including the British military hospital. An intercept that evening reports an unfortunate incident at the hospital, a phrase that will later be revealed as a massacre of doctors, nurses, and patients. Wilkinson reads it and feels nothing. He's moved beyond horror into a kind of numb acceptance. The water supply is failing. Japanese shells have damaged the pipelines, and the reservoirs in the center of the island are running dry. Percival orders water rationing, but it's too late. 60,000 troops and 1 million civilians, and the water will last 3 more days at most. January 15th. Wilkinson receives the intercept he's been dreading. It's from Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashito, the Japanese commander, to his staff. Prepare surrender demands. British position untenable. Water supplies nearly exhausted. Estimate surrender within 48 hours. He reads it twice, then checks his diary entry from December 6th. He'd predicted Singapore would be under siege within 2 weeks of the initial landing, and might fall within 4 weeks. December 8th to January 15th, 38 days. He was off by 10 days. The Japanese were faster than even he predicted. That evening, shells hit the signals intelligence building. Wilkinson is in the basement when the structure takes a direct hit, collapsing the upper floors and severing the power lines. In the darkness, lit only by emergency lanterns, he and his staff burn documents. Not the intercepts, those they pack into cases for evacuation, but the administrative files, personnel records, anything that might help the Japanese identify intelligence personnel. Morrison works beside him, feeding papers into a makeshift incinerator. "Sir," he says quietly, "there's a ship leaving tonight. Small vessel, heading for Java. They're evacuating intelligence staff. You're on the list." Wilkinson shakes his head. "You take it. You're younger. This isn't dash." He stops, unsure how to finish. "This isn't your failure. This isn't your responsibility. But it isn't Morrison's fault either. It isn't even Percival's fault. Not really. It's the fault of a system that gathered perfect intelligence and then ignored it because it contradicted comfortable assumptions." "I'm staying," Wilkinson says. "But you go. That's an order." Morrison hesitates, then nods. They shake hands in the flickering lamplight, and Wilkinson watches his colleague disappear into the smoke-filled street. January 16th. The artillery bombardment is constant now. Japanese shells fall on the city center every few minutes. The hospitals are overwhelmed. Bodies lie in the streets, uncollected. The water has run out completely. What's left is contaminated with sewage and corpses. Cholera is spreading. Wilkinson sits in what remains of his office, surrounded by rubble, and compiles his final intelligence report. It's a formality. There's no one left to send it to, no headquarters still functioning to receive it. But he writes it anyway, documenting everything: the intercepts that predicted the invasion, the warnings that were ignored, the systematic dismantling of British power in Southeast Asia exactly as Japanese communications said it would happen. He ends with a single sentence: Singapore will surrender within 24 hours. January 17, 1942. 9:30 a.m. General Percival, accompanied by his staff, walks toward Japanese lines carrying a white flag and a Union Jack. Wilkinson watches from a distance as the general who commanded a fortress disappears into history as the man who surrendered it. The meeting is at the Ford factory on Bukit-Timah Road, a building that assembled cars just weeks ago and will now witness the largest surrender of British forces in history. Yamashita gives Percival an ultimatum: unconditional surrender by 8:30 p.m., or the assault continues. Percival tries to negotiate terms. Yamashita slams his hand on the table. Wilkinson will hear about this later from officers who were present and demands a yes or no answer. At 7:50 p.m., Percival signs the surrender document. 60,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops become prisoners. Singapore, the impregnable fortress, has fallen in exactly 15 days from the start of the island assault. Wilkinson sits in the ruins of his office and opens his diary one last time. December 8 to February 15, he does the math again, even though he already knows the answer. 70 days from first landing to surrender. He'd predicted it would take 4 to 6 weeks. The Japanese had predicted 2 to 3 weeks. The truth was somewhere in between, and none of it mattered because no one who could have changed the outcome was willing to believe. February 16, 1942. Dawn breaks over a silent city. Wilkinson walks through Singapore streets in the grey morning light, joining thousands of other Allied soldiers who are assembling at collection points under Japanese guard. The city that was filled with the sounds of artillery and aircraft just yesterday is eerily quiet now. The guns have stopped. The bombs have stopped. The only sounds are the shuffling of boots, the occasional barked order from Japanese soldiers, and the distant wail of someone crying. He carries a small case containing his personal effects and one thing he salvaged from the ruins of the Signals Intelligence Building: his diary. The intercepts themselves were either evacuated on the last ships out or destroyed to prevent capture. But his diary remains a record of predictions made, warnings given, intelligence ignored. At the assembly point near the Padang, British officers stand in ragged groups, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces showing shock, exhaustion, and shame. Wilkinson recognizes Colonel Harrison from the 11th Indian Division, a man who commanded 15,000 soldiers 2 months ago and now stands with a handful who survived. He sees Australian officers who held impossible positions for days with no support, no supplies, no hope. He sees men who fought well and men who didn't, and realizes it made no difference in the end. A Japanese officer approaches, young and crisp in his uniform, speaking fluent English. British officers will be interned at Changi. You will march there now. 20 kilometers. Anyone who cannot complete the march will be left behind. Left behind. Everyone knows what that means. They march east through the city, past buildings still smoldering from the bombardment, past corpses that lie unburied in the tropical heat, past civilians who watch them with expressions that mix pity and contempt. The British promised protection. The British promised the fortress was impregnable. The British promised and then surrendered in 70 days. Wilkinson walks beside Major David Arkwright, a staff officer who had sat in on some of the intelligence briefings. Arkwright limps from a shrapnel wound but keeps pace. "You knew," he says after several kilometers of silence. "You bloody knew all of it." "We knew," Wilkinson corrects. "The intercepts were distributed to everyone with ultra clearance. I just believed them. And we didn't." Arkwright is quiet for a moment. "Why didn't we? I saw your reports. They were detailed, specific, accurate. Why did we keep thinking we'd stop them at the next defensive line, that our reinforcements would arrive in time, that the Japanese couldn't possibly maintain their advance?" Wilkinson has had 2 months to think about this question. Because believing the intelligence meant accepting that we were going to lose. That Singapore would fall. That the Japanese were better prepared, better trained, more capable than us. And we couldn't accept that. So we found reasons to doubt the intelligence instead of doubting our assumptions. They march in silence for a while longer. The sun climbs higher, turning the road into a furnace. Men collapse from heat and exhaustion. True to their word, the Japanese leave them behind. Changi is a former British military barracks on the eastern end of Singapore Island. It's designed to house a few thousand soldiers, The Japanese are cramming 60,000 prisoners into it. Wilkinson is assigned to a barracks room that already holds 40 men, with more arriving every hour. The sanitation is non-existent. The food is a bowl of rice once a day. The water is whatever they can collect when it rains. But he's alive, and that's more than thousands of his fellow soldiers can say. More than the sailors on Prince of Wales and Repulse. More than the patients and staff at Alexandra Hospital. More than the soldiers who died defending positions that couldn't be held, retreating down roads that turned into killing grounds, fighting for a fortress that was never as strong as anyone believed. In the first weeks of captivity, as diseases spread through the overcrowded barracks and men die from dysentery and malaria, Wilkinson begins to write. He uses scraps of paper begged or stolen, writing in tiny script to conserve space. He reconstructs from memory the intercepts he received, the warnings he gave, the responses he got. He documents the systematic dismantling of British power in Southeast Asia, not by overwhelming force, but by a smaller, more agile army that did exactly what its communications said it would do. One evening, a British colonel named Webb finds him writing. Webb was on Percival's staff, one of the men in the Fort Canning bunker during those final desperate days. He sits down on the filthy floor next to Wilkinson. "I remember you," Webb says. "You were the intelligence chap who kept insisting the Japanese were going to waltz right through us. Percival thought you were an alarmist." "I was an alarmist," Wilkinson says. "I was just also right." Webb picks up one of the papers, squints at the tiny writing. "You're documenting it all. Why? No one's going to read this. We might not survive this camp, and if we do, no one back home is going to want to hear how badly we muck things up." "Someone needs to know," Wilkinson says quietly. "Someone needs to understand that we had perfect intelligence and we lost anyway because we couldn't believe what it told us. Because we were so certain of our own superiority that we couldn't imagine being beaten by an Asian army. Because we prepared for the war we expected instead of the war we were warned about." Webb is silent for a long time. Then, Percival kept saying the Japanese couldn't do it. Even after Kota Baru, even after Prince of Wales went down, even when they were crossing onto the island, he kept saying they couldn't sustain their advance, that they'd overextended themselves, that we just needed to hold on a bit longer. He genuinely believed it, right up until Yamashita demanded surrender. "I know," Wilkinson says. "That's what makes it a tragedy instead of just a mistake. Everyone was doing what they thought was right. Percival was trying to maintain morale, to project confidence. Brooke-Popham was trying to avoid panic. The staff officers were trying to follow doctrine. No one was incompetent or cowardly. They just couldn't see past their own assumptions. And you could." Wilkinson thinks about this. "I had an advantage. I was reading what the Japanese were telling themselves, not what we were telling ourselves. And what they were telling themselves was true." The months grind on. Men die in the barracks, their bodies removed each morning. Wilkinson contracts malaria, spends 2 weeks in a delirium where he relives the campaign over and over, the intercepts arriving, the warnings ignored, the red arrows on the map pushing inexorably south. When he recovers, weaker but alive, he goes back to his writing. In October 1942, he's part of a work party sent to build a Japanese airfield. The work is brutal 12 hours a day in the sun, minimal food, beatings for anyone who slows down. But it's better than the camp, where disease is killing more men than the Japanese guards. One day, working beside an Australian lieutenant named Chambers, Wilkinson learns that some of the signal's intelligence staff made it out on the last ships. Morrison's name is on the list of evacuees who reached Java before it too fell. Some made it to Australia. Some to India. The intelligence network survived, even if Singapore didn't. Does it help? Chambers asks. Knowing you were right. No, Wilkinson says, shoveling another load of dirt. Being right without being believed is the same as being wrong. But he keeps writing anyway. Late at night, by whatever light he can find, he fills scraps of paper with his account. He hides them in the walls, in the floor, buried in tin cans. Some are discovered and destroyed. Others he rewrites from memory. February 15, 1943. 1 year since the surrender. The prisoners mark the anniversary in silence. Some pray. Some weep. Some stare at nothing, their minds broken by captivity. Wilkinson pulls out his diary, miraculously undiscovered despite multiple searches, and reads his entry from December 6, 1941. If current intelligence proves accurate, Singapore can expect to be under siege within 2 weeks of the initial landing, and may fall within 4 weeks. He'd been off by 10 days. In the calculus of human suffering, of lives lost and destroyed, what did 10 days matter? That night, he has a visitor. It's Webb, the colonel from Percival's staff. He's lost half his body weight, his face is skeletal, but his eyes are clear. I've been thinking about what you said. About documenting everything. Yes. After the war, if there is an after for us, someone's going to write the history of this disaster. They're going to assign blame, make judgments, draw lessons. And they're going to get it wrong because they won't understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of intelligence that contradicted everything we believed about ourselves and our enemy. Probably, Wilkinson agrees. So I want to help. I remember things too. Conversations, decisions, the reasoning behind orders that look insane in hindsight but seemed reasonable at the time. Between your intercepts and my context, maybe we can create a record that actually explains how 60,000 men surrendered to 30,000. They worked together over the following months, reconstructing the campaign from both the intelligence and command perspectives. They document not just what happened, but why it happened, the cultural assumptions, the institutional inertia, the cognitive biases that made it impossible for British commanders to accept that they were going to lose until they'd already lost. August 1945. News filters into the camp that Japan has surrendered. The guards disappear. The gates open. After 3.5 years of captivity, the prisoners are free. Wilkinson weighs 90 pounds. Half the men who marched to Changi with him are dead. But his papers survive, hidden and preserved through years of captivity. He carries them out of the camp, back through Singapore, onto a ship bound for England. He arrives in London in October 1945, a ghost of the man who left 4 years earlier. The intelligence services debrief him, take his papers, classify them. Some become part of the official record. Most disappear into files that won't be opened for decades. In 1946, he testifies at an inquiry into the fall of Singapore. He presents his evidence, the intercepts, the warnings, the predictions that proved accurate. He explains how signals intelligence gave Britain a perfect picture of Japanese intentions and capabilities, and how that picture was rejected because it didn't match expectations. The inquiry thanks him for his service and concludes that the fall of Singapore was the result of multiple factors, including insufficient forces, divided command, and enemy superiority. The role of ignored intelligence is mentioned in a footnote. Wilkinson retires from the service in 1947. He spends his remaining years in a small cottage in Sussex, walking the downs, tending a garden, trying to find peace. He never speaks publicly about Singapore again. But sometimes, late at night, he opens his old diary and reads the entries from November and December 1941. He reads his predictions and compares them to what happened. The dates, the units, the tactics, the timeline, all accurate. Perfect intelligence, perfectly ignored. He thinks about the men who died on the beaches, in the jungle, in the camps. He thinks about the ships that sank, the aircraft that burned, the city that fell. He thinks about everything that might have been different if someone had believed. But he knows the truth that every intelligence officer learns eventually. Information is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as action. You can know everything and change nothing, because knowledge alone doesn't overcome the human need to believe in comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Wilkinson dies in 1968, at the age of 72. His obituary mentions his service in the Far East during the war. It doesn't mention that he predicted one of Britain's greatest military disasters and was ignored. His diary and papers are donated to the Imperial War Museum. In 2001, after 60 years, they're declassified. Historians studying the fall of Singapore discover the intercepts, the warnings, the systematic documentation of an intelligence failure that cost an empire its prestige and 60,000 men their freedom. They conclude, as Wilkinson knew they would, that the fall of Singapore was preventable. That the intelligence was clear. That the warnings were specific. That everything necessary to avoid disaster was known in advance. Everything except the one thing that mattered, the ability to believe.